So I've invited Sherilyn to be my partner in this presentation today because after sharing some factual information about what's in the governor's budget and where things are heading at the state level, I'd like to get into looking at those proposals with the academic researcher and ethnographer in myself now and share some perspectives from what I'm seeing. And I'm going to invite my colleague Sherilyn to challenge me on those perspectives. And then the next lens I'd like to look at that from is from my current hat at Cal State East Bay now as one who's trying to make change in collaboration with my partners from the from the preschool world, from K-12 schools, from community colleges, my fellow partners at UC Berkeley, and in the informal world at Lawrence Hall and Chabot. So how does where the state's going match up with our efforts to address the science, technology, engineering, math needs of kids and young adults? So we'll have those three parts to the presentation, and Sherilyn will share differing perspectives potentially in each of those sections, and I'm going to invite all of you as well so that it's more of a dialogue as opposed to a presentation. So with that, emerging directions. When the K20 network was being formed in its early days and we were having conversations, some of the policy issues were very heated and very difficult with us getting the state to understand the value of having K-12 schools part of a K20 network. And Dave Ernst, who was at CSU at the time in the chancellor's office, said, well, we'll know we've arrived when people in Sacramento are talking about what they want to do with the network instead of the network itself. And so I think that day has finally arrived in California because there's no mention in the governor's budget or in the legislative analyst's office's review of the governor's budget about the network. Rather, for the first time in many years, we're seeing some proposed investments in things that involve the use of the network. So congratulations to CENIC. You've made a lot of progress over the last 13 years. And now we're really discussing what we should be, which is how are we going to improve teaching and learning now with these investments that have been made. So for those of you that are familiar with the budget process, the governor comes out with his budget in January, what she did. And then in February, the Legislative Analyst's Office comes out with a review of what the governor's proposed and gives that review to the legislative staff and the members of the Senate and the Assembly, and then budget hearings start. So those who are insiders in the Capitol like to say that the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. So this is what the governor's proposed. $16.9 million for the California community colleges for three purposes. One, they've noted that we have a California virtual campus. It is actually, there's state law on this, and we've been working to have one for many, many years. But right now, if you go to it, it lists the courses that the different segments offer, and it doesn't offer any online instruction itself. There's no mechanism for enrollment. So they're pointing out that they would like to see the virtual campus help stimulate the offering of 250 courses. The second proposal is to create a centralized or single learning management system for the community colleges as a whole. And the third proposal with this block of funding is to expand options to access instruction in other environments and earn college credit for the knowledge that's demonstrated. So right now in current law, a student in a community college could challenge a course, and if they can demonstrate the knowledge, should get academic credit in lieu of taking that course. But we don't really have the exams set up for all the different array of courses that are offered. So this last piece is to try to get the system to, for example, take some of these MOOCs that are starting to emerge and do crosswalks between the content in the MOOC and what might be in a course, and then show the linkage to an exam, so that by using the MOOC, you can then get away with not having to take a course that may be impacted. So these are the three things. And you know, they don't line out the details of the 16.9 million, so I did some rough calculations, which I would guess then that the amount available for each course would be roughly $60,000. So the next piece shows up in UC and CSU's budget. It's $10 million in each budget, so $20 million total. And it's to offer more online courses in areas of high demand that are prerequisites for the different degrees. And then in the K-12 world, we've always had a lot of policy barriers to online instruction for K-12 students. That got opened up a little bit the last few years, where it could be done under independent study, but you had to have a teacher of record, and it was more synchronous instruction. And now there's a proposal in the budget to enable asynchronous instruction in an independent study. So all of these things are new and different coming from a governor. And the legislative analyst has now come out with their take on what the governor's proposing. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background on some of the histories we've had with the legislative analyst's office. The review is being done by a group that, when we were fighting about the network and its value, this is a group who said that of K-12 schools' connectivity in CalREN, that the legislature had the option to just turn it off for a year while they decided whether it was a good investment by the state or not. So that we would just turn off a network, and then we'd turn it back on again if schools needed the connectivity. So that's the kind of mindset this group is coming at this with. And so anyway, their recommendation is that you don't need to provide any kind of upfront money to the community college system to get everybody on the same learning management system. They should just do it because we know they'll save $100,000 a year by doing it. And we don't think you should provide $36 million to the campuses for online instruction. We think you could get by with maybe $1 million and $20,000 a piece out there to faculty who could create these courses and put them out there. And then this issue of having a front door where we, together across segments, maybe coordinate the offerings of online courses. Well, let's just require the segments to say what they're doing in that regard, because if we require that, then they'll run and do it for us. So these are the kinds of things that will be told to state legislators over the course of the next few months as they try to make sense of what's been proposed. So I'm going to stop there for a moment and ask you if you have any questions about where these things are coming from thus far. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do you see activity in the UC, CSU, and the community colleges to actively inform the legislature on the concerns and inaccuracy of the legislative analyst?
Well, that's a really good question. So what typically will happen is that the budget subcommittees will ask the official spokespersons for each of these segments to come and present their take on the governor's budget. And so I am not certain yet what each of these segments are going to say on the investments. I am pretty sure that each of the segments will be in favor of well, like UC and CSU, I think they're probably going to be in favor of the money for the online courses. From the community college perspective, they may have some takes on different priorities, but they'll probably say good things. But I guess another way of asking your question is, there are a lot of interest groups in education. Like in K-12 alone, there's about 35 that have lobbyists in Sacramento who will show up and say things about these kinds of proposals. And there really isn't an organized voice anymore for investments in online education for higher ed. There's not a group who really speaks for that. And that's kind of a role that CENIC's Teaching and Learning Committee used to have regular meetings, and we would talk about the legislation, and then we would tap our own networks to weigh in on things like this. And with the budget cuts, some of those meetings have fallen by the wayside. But you can see why there needs to be a stronger voice in these matters of how you can now leverage the network. Any other questions? Okay. So, you know, historically, we have raised this flag of we're really glad you're investing in the network, but now you need to invest in a layer of tools and resources that go above the network and support for users so that they will have professional development, how to use the tools and technical support when they don't work. And, you know, so we've raised these kinds of issues. And the state has taken this policy orientation of we're not in the content business, so we're not into funding education to create online content. That should come from the textbook companies and all these other people whose job it is to create all this stuff. So the fact that there is money in the budget is kind of a shift. And the shift comes, though, in a context in which we now have all this discussion about MOOCs and the way they're going to revolutionize learning. And so I'm sure you guys have heard of most of these, where a company, Udacity, for example, that created a MOOC for programmers. There were 160,000 people who participated in that online course. There were about 48,000 that actually completed the course, and then there were about 1,000 whose resumes were recommended to people for jobs. And so you can see a very powerful driver if completing the course and doing it well helps get a person, you know, to an employer's front door. All of a sudden that business model for that online course gets very interesting. The latest is a test and a partnership with San Jose State and Udacity, where they're now trying to create 3 courses as a partnership, public-private partnership with algebra, college algebra, and elementary statistics. The instructors are getting paid about $15,000 per course, which has some faculty concerned about the model. There's also a nonprofit MOOC provider that's been formed, edX, and then, of course, a whole new set of courses arising from a company called Coursera that's doing this on a for-profit basis, and a lot of venture capital money that's going into all of this. And having watched the charter school movement, I know how influential that venture capital can be. And so that can also drive a lot of policy making around MOOCs. So I think this idea of putting MOOCs out there and having exams where if you can learn from one, you can challenge a course in a regular college institution. It's a new concept and one that everybody's still right now trying to digest. So before I move on, where I'm going to go with this next is this is what's out there in the context. Now I'm going to share some perspectives as someone who has now spent a lot of time doing some research and having some experiences around online courses and what I see missing from what's getting talked about in the policy environment. But any other questions on what we've covered so far? Okay. So, and this is the part where after I share a few of these ideas, Sherry, you might want to kick in with differing perspectives. And so we're going to dig in really quickly on the transparency of the learning theories, what information might become available about these courses created by others for the potential users of those courses, some ideas around high-impact teaching practices, and shifts that are happening in the way we teach and how those get reflected in the courses, costs and supports, and finally, teaching as a social act. So we'll touch on those. I want to start with the first one, which is the logic that's used for the underlying course design. Sherilyn helped me think about this in terms of architects and the ways they develop blueprints. Typically, if you're building a house, the architect would meet with you and would say, you know, what are your needs? How many kids do you have? How many bedrooms do you need? You know, what kind of open space do you require? You know, how many bathrooms? All those kinds of things. We do have the other model where an architect creates a tract home and you build so many of those, and if you happen to fit into that kind of house, you can buy it, but you're limited by what's there. And I think the same is true when we start thinking about designing course platforms as well as online courses designed by somebody else for somebody else to use. When you shift into that model, you're getting the tract home, and if it fits you, great, and if it doesn't, you have to learn to live with it. Whereas when you're designing from scratch, you have some freedom to shape what's being built for what your needs are. And the same is true with online courses. We had an example where we, when I was with CENIC, drew partners from each of the segments and sat down to really talk about kids who were failing the high school exit exam 6 times, had gotten to be 18 and 19, and still needed help with English and math. And in our group, before we did anything, we sat down and defined what the population's needs were. And based on what we knew of the students, we then said, okay, so if these are their needs and their challenges, how is it that we can get them to passing the exam? And we came up with a theory for what they needed to be able to grasp the concepts and the material. And these are examples of what we came up with for English language arts and for math. And then we picked the technology tools and the ways in which we designed based on what we knew about the students' needs. And so, you know, we used a variety of tools. The tools for English were not the same as the tools for math. The approaches for English were not the same for math. In English, because we knew we had a lot of second language learners who we had voiceovers so they could hear what we were telling them. We made very visible through bubbles like you'd see in a cartoon what the thinking practices were that we'd gotten from good readers and writers that these students may not have been told as they came into our system about how to approach the reading and the writing. There were highlights that went across the text so that as they heard the voiceover, they could keep up with where we were in the text, because as a second language learner, that can be a challenge. In the math, we had the math concept. We showed video of a real life scenario like a skateboarder or palm trees to show the concept that was getting taught. Then we had games that were built off of like a theme of nursing or gardening, or places they might put the concepts to work in, and they played games. And then it was, how is this going to show up on a test? So you had signs and symbols and all of that. So in both of these instances, we had ideas about how you put the conceptual hooks in place for students to get the information at different tools. So anyway, when it's not just create a course and put it in a library and somebody else can go pick it up and it's going to work with students. You actually have to think through what it is that they need. So that's one concern I have that I don't hear getting discussed. So Sherry, countering view.
Well, so my observation is just that when you talk about, the tract home versus the custom home, and you look at the kind of funding that the state is talking about giving for these things, they're, I think, a bit at odds, right? The state is looking for templates, boilerplates. They're looking for the tract home blueprint that they can hand out to 20 different developers to go build those tract homes, and there's a sense that that's very cost effective. And if you have to build a custom home, or even if it's a custom tract home, which is what you're kind of suggesting here, the economies don't quite work out the same way. The government's expectation is X. The education developer has an expectation that's Y, and the cost of Y is significantly more, I would argue, than the cost of X. So how do you find a sort of a compromise or a way to convince the legislature that you need more money, basically?
Right, right. So the second is that, what we learned in our experiences of building these courses, and then we actually had ethnographic researchers in the field watching the implementation of these as other people other than those who designed it took it up, adult schools, high schools, library partners, community-based organizations. We watched what the developers had done with it and how they taught it, and then how it was getting used with these folks. And we were able to see things that the developers took for granted in their teaching that didn't get picked up in what we built and caused problems out in the field because it wasn't part of the course. And we were able to do 2 or 3 rounds of development to actually make sure we put all the right stuff in the tool. So here's an example. Our math professor, Larry Green from Lake Tahoe, when he worked with students, he realized many of them, because they were second language learners, just needed help with math vocabulary. And so he would, in his Illuminate Live or CCC Confer sessions, work on the vocabulary. So then we had to go back into the course and add a lot of vocabulary resources that the students could use on their own time, but they were also there for other instructors to use in the future. And we had to add that to our explicit work with our partners and how to use these resources, that was a need, and here's what we have for you there. So a lot of times, you may have one thing planned, but what actually happens is different. And when you look at this course is successful, it may be successful because of all those other things you did rather than the material itself that you built for the course and are now handing off to someone else. So, Sherry, any comments on that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I'm agreeing with you on this one because, in fact, teachers who are really good teachers will say that it isn't just hand me a set of materials and a rote way of teaching those materials. It's really about what the teacher brings to the party. And I think that one of the things that you're seeing in your work is the iterative process is what the teacher is bringing to the party. She or he is looking at how are the students using the materials, what works, what doesn't work. They're doing analysis, they do data gathering, they do analysis. This all sounds very familiar to people who've done any sort of, science experiments, for example, deductive reasoning, right? Look at the data, analyze the data, inform your next actions by what you've learned from that. And that's what a good teacher does on a regular basis I don't mean to offend anyone here, but there are a lot of teachers who come out of our system who don't have those skills, and so they won't go through this process. And so what people are hoping for, and when I say people, I mean the people who fund these types of efforts, is a product out of this that then any teacher who just grabs it can use without having to think and observe, analyze, adjust. And so I worry a little bit about that.
So the third thing that we really have seen or think about in the academic world is that whatever the teacher has presented in terms of course material or the online course content is just one component of what is present within a classroom environment. So the students and what they bring into that classroom and what they share with one another is also a form of material to be learned in that classroom. So if you have a course and it has successful outcomes, it may be related to what the teacher presented in course material. It may be related to what the teacher said. It may be related to what the other students shared and how they were able to support one another. And so the course content itself is just one component of what's available. The same point. So anything else?
No, I think that's good.
So then the next thing that we talk a lot about is we're trying to move away from this mode of sage on the stage, which unfortunately I'm being today, and, and more of an inquiry-based approach to teaching where students are researching, problem solving, doing some of the things like you saw in the presentations with iLabs and with Acme Animation, where they're collaborating with someone else with expertise who's sharing that expertise with the students as they work on projects. And so it's no longer, I'm delivering the content in a static mode, but the technologies and collaboration tools are being used for exploration. And so how do you build that into these new courses, and how do you make sure that that approach is a fundamental part of the way the courses are built? So it's a lot different than the old models.
I also agree with that and think that the challenge there, of course, is how do you reframe the teacher education process so that teachers are taught how to do that, right? The young up-and-coming teachers understand that that's really their charge as opposed to delivering specific content. It does, by the way, for those of you who are old like me, cause one a little bit of pause, a little concern, because I was a teacher when they did things like new math. And a lot of these concepts with regard to, for example, teaching students how to think and how to learn rather than teaching them discrete facts are not new ideas. And some of those experiments, and I will admit that I once, with some well-meaning and smart friends, tried to create a private K-6, K-4 school. And our kids had a wonderful time. They were treated like real human beings and thinking people, and they got the worst education you could imagine out of that school. And when they went back to public school, they were all behind the other children, their peers, because we focused too much on the developing human being and not enough on the real nuts and bolts kinds of foundational learning that kids need. And so I'm not saying do one or the other. I'm saying there's sort of a balance there, and I'm not sure where that balance lives, but you have to be careful.
Right. So the other thing that we learned from these experiences, such as with these online English and math courses, is that it took us $3 million to develop those two courses. Now, in fairness, it was both content It was instructional delivery with the hybrid mode. There was a lot of research around it and a lot of reworking of the programming as we built the courses, and then support for a network of users that we grew over time. But it was about $1.5 million a piece. I'm working on another project, which I'll touch on in a minute, and it is to build a model for significantly transforming a communications course to embed the teaching of long-term and futures thinking. And even in that R&D work in that course, it's costing us about $150,000 a year because you need the release time for the faculty member. We have a consultant who's working with us on the content side and on building assessments. We have myself working on it and another person who's helping to video and get all the records required for the research around the new model. So that's $150,000 each year for 2 years. And by working deeply at that level and figuring out what kids are learning as we're trying different approaches, we'll have enough information then to take a model and put it into lots of different kinds of courses, not just communications, but it does take investment. And we're tying all of the research around our institutional learning outcome for critical and creative thinking. So the community college proposal was $50,000 per course, if you roughly 50-60 from the governor's budget, and if you go with the legislative analyst recommendation, the amount goes down to about $20,000. So what kinds of courses are we building for $20,000 to $50,000, and what kind of evidence do we have underneath them that they're effective, and effective at what? So Sherry, did you want to add something on that one?
No, I think that's the same point that we made earlier with regard to the legislature. When they pass these kinds of bills, they're looking for cost efficiencies. And I think what you're saying to us is there's no magic here. It costs more than you think it costs.
So the last thing I'd mention is that we still suffer in the field with the lack of access to computers. Teachers need mobile devices so that they can be in different locations while they're participating and collaborating, both as professionals with their learning community and with their students. We still need, in many instances, in a lot of instances, teachers, when they show up to work at a new school, they are not given a computer. They are not given a phone. Some of the tools we take for granted in our work world, they are not given. Software packages for collaboration and various cloud services, if they want them, they must pay out of their own pocket. Until recently, I've been doing the same for a lot of the things I use at East Bay. We need to be looking at the shared collaboration tools and licenses for joint use across institutions, so we can do things regionally across the K20 community, tools above and beyond those that CENIC currently provides. And then, using these new tools and figuring out, as Kimmy said earlier, there's a variety of tools now. So which tool is good for what purpose? And we need to be sharing our findings around that as educators. So these things to me are like critical must-have yesterday resources, and that's not in the dialogue. And then the last one I want to mention is this whole notion of teaching as a social act. Now, Sherry shared the building analogy. I'm just going to say that, for those of us in education who are in it, not for the money, but because we're passionate about our field, we're passionate about our kids and their needs, to say you can just import somebody else's course and go teach it is like Sherry sharing her underwear with me. Now, I could wear it, but I'm probably not going to, right? And it's really offensive if she offers it to me. Not that she has. But that's how it feels. I mean, this is our personal stuff we do every day with kids because we care. And so the notion you can just pass it around, everybody can use it, is kind of weird. So it's a build it, they'll come use it. And NSF actually is doing some interesting research called virtual organizations as socio-technical systems. And I'm intrigued by it because I actually started doing some research around the teams that we form for things like the stepping program and what it takes to bring people with diverse knowledge who speak different languages together to create something like a hybrid online course program. And so it's really about bringing people together, sharing expertise, developing shared knowledge and relationships that then let you move forward in designing and creating something together. It's an art of its own. And so NSF's recognizing that in their virtual organization research work. And in the first kind of complex education partnership, when I was with CENIC that we put together, it was a program called Professional Development Resources Online Mathematics, PD-ROM, and Russ may remember it, I'm not sure. You know, I won't name all the partners. But in that work, we created this team, and they did a wonderful job, and the resource is still available. You can go to the website. But that team's work was that team's work. And then the model was, now let's share that out across the state. And it had limited adoption and use. When we worked on the stepping program, we had a different model, which was there was a team that was the development team. But at that point in time, CENIC had this sort of intersegmental group called the K20 California Education Technology Collaborative. And so we had people from all the different segments who were in positions of leadership in the segments in instructional technology use. And they were seen as the first layer of implementing partners. So their thoughts and ideas were engaged in the design and development at the very beginning of this project. And now when you know, I have data to show this, when you look at the trajectory of what happened to the stepping program when we were ready to go beyond the initial team that developed it, you have this wonderful trajectory line up of people taking up and using the course. So it really made a difference to pay attention to the social networks and to think about you're creating for a social network. So Sherry?
I think that I think you know I agree with you on this point strongly. The difficulty, of course, is as our friend Judith Green says, building that network is even harder than building the network we've already built. So the physical network that we've built with CalREN is certainly a wonderful tool to allow the people to build the human network that creates these virtual organizations, but it's a tremendous amount of work. And so one of the points I wanted to sort of go back to, Stephanie, is I've been in the teaching business years ago. I know teachers today in K-12. A lot of you in the audience do too. And so I know that a lot of people end up, not only do they not get a cell phone and a laptop from the school that they go to work for, they have to go buy their own school supplies. If they want their kids to have a particular project that requires colored construction paper, they have to go to the arts and crafts store and pay with their own money and not get reimbursed by the school for that construction paper. I hear these kinds of stories from teachers all the time, and that hasn't changed over the years. So I guess the bigger question from my perspective, because I'm not I don't know policy stuff as well as you do, and that's where I rely on your expertise. Why is it so hard to get funding for teachers, you know, speaking as a former teacher? Why doesn't the state pay enough money for me to be able to do my job? Why don't they give enough money to the schools so that the supplies are there, or give me a stipend so that I can get these resources? Why, when I go to work for CENIC, one of the first things I get my very first day on the job is a laptop computer that belongs to CENIC that is issued to me, and it's usually, by the way, a brand new computer. But when I go to work as a teacher, where we're trying to say use technology more in your teaching, I don't get a laptop.
Good point. And there's a lot of, the most significant policy debate right now at the state level is the governor's proposal to get away with a lot of what we call categorical programs, strings that have been put out there for K-12. They'll get this little bit of money if they do this thing and this little bit of money if they do that thing. Rather, we're going to collapse all that and have a per pupil amount that the amount depends on the concentration of students from poor families and second language learners in your school. So if you have a high concentration, you'd get a little extra money compared to other schools. So we're going to put it out there in a per pupil way, and we're going to let you all decide that locally, which, you know, the concerns on that are that, okay, the dollars then in that budget will get bargained locally, and there'll be a lot of pressure to put that into the salary schedule. Then the dollars will be gone, and we'll never get at the computers. The people on the other side saying, well, now you have all the freedom to buy teachers' computers if it's your highest need. So personally, I think there's merit to looking at resourcing schools equally with higher concentrations, but I too fear that some of these needs, in order to make the transformations required in education today, won't get met through that approach. So it's very challenging.
Going back to number 6, it's still tied to the social impact and change, and we talked about mobile devices and bandwidth at home. I guess I'm just asking this question. This is related to the bandwidth at home and what you've seen out there. Just from a social, like, is it the school's responsibility to deal with that? I mean, we all in this room and at this conference want to try to do those things, but you know, what seems to be the feeling out there? Where does it stop, you know, from society? Maybe it doesn't at all, right, as far as the responsibility in trying, versus the parents that have the means. I mean, because $300 to $500 for, you know, whatever medium income that is, should be, when we talked about school supplies and teachers doing it, that should be the investment in our children. We're willing to pay $500-700 for some pads and a helmet. Why, you know, why not
Right.
$500 for an iPad? You know,
Right.
and so I mean, so I'm just kind of what your experience and what you're seeing out there, I guess, for my own personal knowledge of where it balances out or doesn't.
Yeah, well, this is kind of getting ahead of the last part of our presentation. I'm gonna come back to that because I think it's fundamental that we have access to bandwidth for parents and kids, and I'll share why.
You do make a good point, though, Russ, with regard to decisions that parents make. And so I'll share a personal story. My own brother spent quite a bit of money on Taekwondo for his daughters. He himself is a black belt. He thought it was a really important thing for them to get those skills and get the discipline and all of that. So the uniforms, the training gear, when you're really young, the pads, there's a lot of money you put into that. And he had no problem at all spending the money on that and on these lessons twice a week that were not inexpensive either. They had no internet access at home because that wasn't important to him. And he didn't understand that it was important for his children. Maybe not so much when they were in elementary school, but by the time they got to junior high and some of their friends were using the internet to do research, it disadvantaged his children. And so one year for Christmas, I bought them a computer, and just a desktop computer, nothing fancy. And I gave them as a gift internet access until the younger of the two girls graduated from high school. And so I gave my brother the cost of his internet access, high-speed internet access, for the entire junior high and high school years for those two girls. Not because I'm a wonderful person, but because I know how important this is to their ability to access things online and have a different quality of education when they're in the home, right? When they're at school, they have whatever the school has, and they're at a school that's highly connected. But when they go home, they lose that. And he didn't get that that was an important thing for their education. And so I said, I'm not going to try to convince you that I'm right. I'm simply going to provide this as a gift to my nieces, because it doesn't cost you anything for me to do this for my nieces, and I'm pretty sure I'm right. And it wasn't until they both were safely in college that he realized, I see now, right, looking backwards, I see how this has really helped them. And so he's kept the connection, which he thankfully now pays for. And when they come home on college breaks, they're able to use that connection. But he didn't get it. He didn't see that it was important. And as a taxpayer, I would say, why should I pay for that? If you can afford soccer stuff, you can afford an internet connection. Why should the taxpayers pay for that? Why should the school have to deliver a gigabit to your home when you can afford to buy it from AT&T?
So I think while I'm raising concerns about things that I'd love to see in the dialogue while we're talking about state investment in online courses, I'm not trying to say that there shouldn't be an investment. And it hurts me to even maybe be arguing against that investment, because I do believe that it is going to take resources, and we'll share in a minute, some priority areas that I think are important from the perspective of trying to help kids be successful in STEM. But what I am saying mirrors comments, I can't even believe I'm saying it, but when we first were creating the K-12 connectivity to the K20 network, we had a state board member who said, here we have the right standards, we have the right textbooks, we have the right teacher professional development, we have the right tests, and here come your big pipes bringing sewer water into the classroom. Meaning all this stuff we just got them not to do, now you're going to make them do it by providing them access. And so I'm only mentioning this because we have to be careful that what we are promoting for use is what it takes for students to be successful. And online course content could be very helpful in particular areas if designed well. And I think Sherilyn has helped me think about that a little bit more, about what has to be designed with a specific purpose in mind, and therefore designed a special way, versus what is universal regardless of what you're teaching, what subject area, what grade level. And I think the one area to me that becomes very universal is this one here, the collaboration tools. Because if you're about inquiry-based teaching and helping students learn the practices and ways of thinking of scientists and engineers, your rank and file classroom teacher is not going to have that knowledge. They're going to have to collaborate with someone outside the walls of that classroom. And so things like the Acme model or the iLabs model then become very powerful in thinking about that. And the same could be true of almost any subject you name. So, to me then, if we were to start prioritizing investments of what goes beyond the network itself, these kinds of things, to me, rise to the top. So, the policy impact then of these things, we're not sure. What needs and whose needs and what needs are going to be addressed? I mean, it's still very unclear. So now I want to shift to the third part, which is sort of the work that I'm now doing at East Bay, not just on campus, but also in the broader region, especially Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and sort of how I'm thinking about these policy issues from that perspective, that lens. And we're at a campus at East Bay that is very online learning friendly. It's been a leader in the space for many, many years, so it's not technophobic. The Institute was funded by Bayer Healthcare, and to use the CEO's words, not mine, he said, I looked around and there aren't enough white guys around that are going to fill all the lab coats. We really have to do something about diversifying the STEM pathways and exciting students in STEM so that they'll want to pursue these pathways and be able to fill these jobs. So he helped to fund the Institute along with a developer in the region who has a lot of space that's used by STEM companies and startups who also said, you know, these folks are growing, they have good jobs, and they can't find workers, and other states and other countries are coming here to take them away because there's not the workforce. So, you know, we need this issue solved yesterday. And on our campus, there was actually a desire by faculty in the College of Education and in the College of Science and the two deans to come together and work together regularly. They meet every 2 weeks. And so my job was really to facilitate the partnerships and the new ways of working on campus as well as with community partners. And so when we look at redesigning our instruction, we're looking at whatever research data we can find. This particular set of data comes from Bayer. They actually spent a lot of money on this. They have done research with their minority chemists and engineers. And a lot of the things that come up in the research about what hinders progress is about the sort of social aspect, and therefore reinforces this idea of collaborative teaching models where the students are having access to a network of professionals outside the college that are helping to inform their thinking about what they're preparing for and what the real work is. And many of these students that we get have not had an engineer in their life, have not had a scientist in their life. So we have to demystify what does it even mean to be an engineer. And a lot of students don't even know that there are many flavors of engineering. So there's a lot to expose students to, and the collaboration models in coursework really help with that. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, working to infuse STEM in other disciplines. And I mentioned this long-term thinking project. And in this design that we're working on, the students are actually listening to podcasts by an organization called the Long Now Foundation out of San Francisco. And they've done things like they've been building a 10,000-year clock that will tick for 10,000 years, and talking about the design elements of trying to do that. And it's being built in a mountainside in another state, and I mean, it's really wacky stuff. But if you were to go online and look up these podcasts, the topics of people who've looked at the last 10,000 years like yesterday and the next 10,000 years like tomorrow are all speakers who in some way, shape, or form are touching on STEM. So you have like Alex Wright, the information architect for the New York Times, who's done a talk on learning, culture, and technology, and has traced it all the way back when knowledge was offloaded in beads for people who became nomadic and had to store information that was no longer about whose family you were in. So, you know, so they're learning STEM in a very not indirect way, and looking at the patterns of what does it mean to be a long-term thinker. How do these people think? How do they use what they learned from the past to make future predictions? And they're using not only the podcasts, but the blog posts and online journaling and their Blackboard LMS system. And then they're going out and doing interviews, so they're using technologies to record, and they're doing web research, and they're analyzing the communications and what's getting said, and then they're building multimedia projections of the future that are grounded in evidence from both the podcasts and their interviews. So, you know, our underlying learning theories supporting that are things like you have to take these students who, like me, had no experience with thinking about thinking long term, and so we're novices and we want to be experts, and this organization over here says these people on these podcasts are experts. So we had to go through the process of figuring out, well, what's it mean to be an expert? And so that's where we go through discourse analysis and this whole belief from a constructionist perspective that we can, by having the students do the analysis, by working together to then identify the practices, apply them to an organization that the kids are involved with in the course, together we're developing shared understandings of what it means to be an expert in long-term thinking. Something none of us, not even the instructors of the course, knew what it was, and we're developing it together. And so we're creating these mental frameworks in our heads of what it means and how you go about it by examining these patterns and practices. And so really what we're doing in this course is we're teaching our students how to read the world from an ethnographic lens. We're asking that, you know, in this podcast, in these organizations, who can do what, with whom, under what conditions, where, how. You know, it's an approach to understanding your environment that's new to you. You know, all this is rooted in anthropology and looking at culture and looking at expertise and transferring that expertise from experts to novices like us. And so our thinking is that this fits nicely with our institutional learning outcome on critical and creative thinking, and we're asking our students as their exit exam, how did this course require you to think differently than you have in the past? What new things did you have to learn how to do in order to do this work? And asking them to directly give us feedback on how it matched up with the ILO. And you know, it's nice that they're learning about the past, but if we can teach them to do this, they can walk into any environment now and apply the same approach. They can walk in as a communications major to a STEM company and start asking these same things to understand that environment, what they're going to have to be communicating about, with whom, under what conditions, how, in what ways. So that's our logic to it. So in this example, you know, it's not a MOOC, and we're not drawing on a MOOC for course content, but in essence, our textbook for the class are the podcasts, the 200 plus podcasts that are on the Long Now Foundation's site. So as teachers, we have both the instructor in our team and the textbook authors, but we have all these speakers as our instructors teaching this information to students. And then we have the authors of the website materials that are getting analyzed, and the individuals interviewed, and the students. So if you think about learning as whose expert knowledge a student has access to, and helping them learn from hearing the experts, we've all of a sudden increased exponentially the teaching and who the students have the ability to learn from. So it's not just two people creating an excellent course and sharing it, it's a ton of people. So Sherry, did you want to add in?
So I had the pleasure of seeing some of Stephanie's work recently with some of her students in this particular project, and I have to say I was quite impressed, because the course that Stephanie and her colleague have developed combines both some very specific deliverables that these students have to adhere to in order to pass the course. But the process by which they reach those deliverables require them to have to learn how to learn. And so they're getting both a deeper set of skills as well as a sense of there are these things that I need to, tasks that I need to complete to deliver to pass this course. And so it's the combination of content and skill sets. So I actually was quite impressed.
And they also did the same interview with Cisco, and one of the students crossed both teams and then came and said, oh my God, I see totally how Cisco fits with CENIC, and oh my God, it's a small world. So it was really quite fun. We are 5 minutes, I guess, from time. So is that right, Sherry?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to speed through here to get to the question you asked, Russ. So we're also working in our broader community to look at the challenges kids face at each stage of the education continuum in STEM. And here's our challenge and why we care so much about our regional work. We want more STEM students at East Bay, even though we want to infuse STEM in all of our courses, not just our STEM majors. But when we look at the path, 1,600 community college students that are coming into East Bay from our area community colleges, 600 from 2 of them. Looking at those colleges, we get an average of 1 in engineering each year for the last 4 years and 5 to 7 in computer science. We are never going to make it in the Bay Area with those kinds of numbers. So we must work with our colleagues to engage, interest, prepare, and pull more students through this path.
One of them, I can tell you, is an art major. that would be my daughter.
So we're trying to work with our colleagues in a multi-stakeholder collaborative across the 2-county region of Alameda and Contra Costa County to address those problems. And that involves work with 36 school districts, 17,000 teachers. I mean, it's the scale is massive. We have started our work in the first 3 areas where we found that the kids not passing algebra were the same array of kids not performing at grade level in math in 3rd grade. And in digging further down, we saw the same array in preschool at 3. And we also uncovered evidence of work being done where that trajectory had gotten changed by work with preschool educators and parent engagement strategies where they're teaching math concepts to very young children. And so that is an example of if we're going to turn this big problem around systemically, you have to work with the parents, starting very young. STEM and out of school time, we found less than an hour a week of science in grades K-5, so we're working hard to get STEM into our state-funded after-school programs. We have MOUs with 170 and we're aiming for 250. And we're supporting a community of after-school providers by bringing them together for workshops via video conferencing where they meet at 7 go-to sites, and then we archive everything from our presenters and share it online and all those kinds of things. And now we're working our way into a new action group. You know, we wanted to phase these in given limited staffing, where we're looking at how to support industry-themed instruction at the high school level and to make those linkages early, at least 10th grade, with community college programs and faculty and CSU and UC college programs, faculty engaging with those students before they ever leave high school so that we have the contacts to pull them through the path. And in that work, again, I think that creating an academic-like Facebook environment that has electronic portfolios in it and other things where we can regularly engage the students and their parents and invite them to the various events we have that we need to make more strategic use of on a year-round basis. If we don't do that, we'll never get those numbers turned around. And so if students don't have bandwidth in their homes and they don't have mobile devices or computers in their homes, there's no way with 36 school districts and 470 some odd thousand kids that I'm ever going to really be able to reach them. And so some of these new technologies that allow for Wi-Fi to be placed in low-income neighborhoods at reasonable rates, building those into low-income housing and all of that, essential. And we're advocating for that in our regional network with our partners.
See any like suggestions of surcharges and things like that?
You know,
because E-rate hasn't tapped into the sale or the cable companies that benefit from that program, and I don't, you know, the PUC hasn't done it yet with CTF, and so that's where the growth, the 1MBs and that stuff is all going away, but the growth is in the sale, and you know, the other areas of like cable company doing data services.
you know, I think our awareness of what's possible and capable and all of that is much greater than the general public's awareness. And I think we have to build models for how you put all these pieces together that include things like that, and then share them out beyond get one success going in a region and then share out the models. So again, I'm going to just quickly, last two slides. These would be my top 5 areas for investment. I mentioned earlier the early STEM learning. We do have some resource needs for videos that show what it looks and sounds like when you teach young children math concepts effectively. You know, those aren't in the public domain right now. We do need the collaboration tools. We need the Acme-like models at the high school level and at the undergraduate level that create that engagement model to deal with those social network issues you saw the research around. It would be helpful to have a front door for online courses, because we do have students who want to come to pursue STEM degree but have to work, and so they have to do some of this online. And especially half the students who come to East Bay to major in STEM get put down a different path in our freshman learning communities because they haven't met the English and math requirements. So we really do need some shared courses. So if we can take the governor's proposals and flesh them out a bit and help them be effective for these kinds of needs, then I think we can make a lot of progress in the year ahead. So, thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one question.
Yeah.
I almost feel like I have to apologize for this because you said so many wonderful things, but there's one little thing that you said that caught my ear. And it was about a lot of times the students who speak English as a second language or have poor English skills have problems with math vocabulary that interferes with their learning. And where my head went was the stories that I know of schools for deaf students that concentrate in oral-only instruction. A lot of times what happens is the math and science classes kind of turn into math and science vocabulary classes where they spend a lot of time teaching people how to say 7 and 5 as opposed to adding 7 and 5. And I'm wondering if there are economic reasons for this. Maybe it just takes a lot of money to support a quadzillion languages as we have in California, or whether or not there are overarching policy reasons why it wouldn't be possible to simply teach the math classes in the student's native language. And it even seems that the network could enable that, because if there is somebody who is really good at teaching geometry in Khmer, for example, you can use the network to share that person around as a resource. I'm wondering, and I'm not a teacher, I don't necessarily know if there's an easy, quick answer for that question that I'm just missing.
Yeah, several things come to mind in that question. One is, yes, I think we should be exploring technologies that let us differentiate within the student's native language. When I started in education, I actually was working with the Bilingual Coalition because we supported sheltered English and bilingual strategies, and I happened to be a believer that there's a lot of research to suggest we should continue learning in the native language, but it's not our state's policy right now. But with technologies, you know, I think there could be offerings outside the home, and I don't know why we think of learning as happening during the school day. In our regional network, we're taking the viewpoint of learning 24/7 and surrounding students with learning opportunities in and out of school, and working to connect the learning opportunities so they're different, but they support one another. And I think we can look at all the online resources in native languages in that way in today's policy environment.
Thank you.
Thanks.